As of the time of writing, there were over 100 E.G.Os in Limbus company, and while a handful receive a lot of attention, many others are quickly forgotten or written off for various reasons. I want to shine a light on these often overlooked E.G.Os and demonstrate that some genuinely deserve a second look. Whether they gain some new relevance due to a new release ID or a recent gameplay change, these E.G.Os weren't fully appreciated at first, and all the E.G.Os I want to discuss today have a use case that really should be considered more, even if they can still be a little niche. With all that out of the way, let's start with the first E.G.O. The first E.G.O I want to talk about was released all the way back in Season 3, Bon Voyage, which was released as part of that season's Battle Pass, which was a mixed bag to say the least, and out of that mixed bag, the E.G.O I want to discuss is 92 Faust. 92 Faust has probably one of the worst reputations of any E.G.O in Limbus, and I think that's a little unfair. It first got dismissed the second it was released for a simple reason. Faust had no burn ID, which was a common issue in the early days of Limbus, where many E.G.Os were sidelined due to lack of a corresponding status ID for certain centers. Some E.G.Os had straight up ridiculous gaps between the release and a center's first ID for a particular status. However, for 92 Faust, it changed a little over a year after its release once LCE Faust was released. And then it proceeded to be quickly disregarded again due to a lack of synergy. So I want to prove today that this E.G.O is nowhere near as bad as some people say it is. Let's start with the first thing most people often talk about with this E.G.O, and that's the passive, which inflicts burn on head hit if you're using a lust skill. Some of you may already know this, but LCE Faust doesn't have a lust skill in her kit whatsoever. If I had to guess why, it's probably so her infinities will add up more with the abnormality the gear is based off, or Blossom Moth, which, despite being a burn abnormality literally on fire and is based on a session, does not contain a single lust skill. LCE Faust's skill 2 really should have been a lust skill, and that's probably my biggest gripe with her design-wise, but I'm getting a little off topic. The main thing about this E.G.O that most people overlook is the main effect of the E.G.O, which converts 2 burn in the enemy into defense level down up to 10 times. This effect is the other thing people often criticize when talking about this E.G.O, because converting 20 burn potency looks like to be a modest payoff isn't worth it, and I personally disagree for a couple of reasons. First, 20 burn potency is extremely easy to obtain, like ridiculously easy for most burn teams, and that's not even including some other burn E.G.Os like Capote Ishmael and 4th Match Flame Yisang, both of which can inflict 10 burn potency by themselves. Second, the actual payoff of the E.G.O being inflicting 10 defense hull-down is actually pretty good. While the numbers are a little bit fuzzy, 10 defense hull-down roughly translates to 2 to 3 fragile, which is quite solid. The only problem with this E.G.O in my opinion is, for you to get the max effect, you need Faust to go first because all the effects are same turn. That problem doesn't seem so bad at first, but when you take a closer look at it, Faust really struggles to gain haste, and that's not just an LCE Faust. There are not many good ways to make Faust go fast that doesn't involve some sort of sacrifice. Your best option is probably using Everlasting twice and getting haste for its passive, but that's not a very good option for a multitude of reasons. Mainly because you're spending way too much for effect too little. If you want extra damage on a burn team, you would probably be much better off running revaluation and just spamming Force for the Flames, which inflicts 2 next turn fragile. It doesn't involve spending any burn potency. And while I wouldn't personally do that because revaluation isn't the greatest idea in the world, and as I mentioned before, potency is never an issue, but it does highlight the main problem clearly. Oh no, I think 92 Faust is a pretty good E.G.O that people misunderstand. It has issues, sure, but it's not a lack of a lust skill or potency loss that's a problem, it's her speed. If Faust ever got a hypothetical sync East ID with a lust skill, this E.G.O would be incredibly solid, but as of now, I think it's just alright and not much else. The next E.G.O I want to talk about is AEDD Gregor. AEDD is different from the other E.G.Os in this video because it's actually quite talked about, but it still gets sidelined because of Gregor's lack of a great idea to go along with it. And I'm here to prove why that even though Gregor doesn't synergize with this E.G.O, it still provides a lot of utility and is a vital piece of a great Rupture strategy. First, looking at the actual effects of this E.G.O, there are just 2. Gregor getting some charge count and inflicting a unique status called Spark Discharge. The charge part I'm going to ignore because it doesn't really do a whole lot without a good Gregor charge ID, so I'm going to focus on Spark Discharge. Spark Discharge works as follows. When a target with the effect is hit, the attacker gains 1 charge count. Additionally, when the target is hit by a Gloom attack, they will gain 1 Rupture count. The description can be a bit misleading because regardless of what skill hits the target, Spark Discharge will always decrease by 1. Anyway, the charge isn't relevant to what I want to talk about, but the Rupture count is really important, and it's what people often talk about when this E.G.O is discussed. This effect can turn many count neutral or negative skills into count positive ones, which really helps in getting Rupture stack off the ground and maintained. The main beneficiary of this E.G.O is undoubtedly Lord Honglu as a Gloom skill one that is count neutral, or Spark Discharge will turn into a 2 count positive skill one, which is really solid and makes his entire skill rotation far less count negative. This also goes for a bunch of other Rupture IDs, allowing stacks to build faster and stay alive much more consistently. Now, the next portion of this video will be dedicated to discussing a strategy and team with this E.G.O in mind, so things might get a little complicated, so I'm going to try my best to keep things as simple as possible. What I have here is a Rupture team that benefits greatly from AEDD Gregor, and another E.G.O I'll be mentioning shortly. Now, it may seem a little strange, and the deployment order even stranger, but all will make sense after I explain the strategy I have in mind. If you do want a more in-depth reason why this team is the way it is, I'll put one on screen so you can read it at your own pace, but one about the show should explain it just fine. Unfortunately, most of this team composition is pretty non-negotiable. The only IDs you really could swap are Mount Faust with Mount Otis and W Clip Yiseng with Wei Yiseng. I wouldn't personally recommend that, but it does make the strategy a little better. Also, side note, there are not many good 7-center battles in the game at the moment that aren't super spoiler heavy, so I won't be able to show a lot of good images, but I will have a video uploaded on this channel with the strategy in play. On turn 1 of this team, you want to use Super B and Slot and can tempt all Ryosha so she can generate some eco resources that will be vital for this team. This can make Ryosha's SP get hit pretty hard, but Middle Assault Support passive should help to offset that. While you're at it, try to use E.G.Os Gregor and Rodian's Clash cards so they gain Serpent Arm, which allows them to gain a great amount of poise potency needed for their kits. After waiting to around turn 3 to 4, you should be able to use both the Midget Shredder Yiseng and AEDD Gregor. And after you do that, the fun can really begin. With both these E.G.Os, this Rupture team goes from good to straight up broken with how much counter you can inflict per skill rotation, assuming you've fulfilled all the conditionals on your team. After this point, just make sure to use AEDD Gregor again whenever Shock Discharge goes away, and you should have a really high Rupture count stack. Once you get to about 8 to 12 Rupture count on the enemy, you want to use G.A. Ishmael's Evade to Retreater and bring in, wait for it, Hex Nail Sinclair. Now, this may seem like a strange choice, but it's for one reason, and it's the last piece that really makes a strategy work, and it's Branch of Knowledge. Now, before you click off the video, hear me out. I'm not going to defend the main problem with this E.G.O, which is its SP gimmick, but I do want to say the 12 Rupture potency inflicted by this E.G.O can do some ridiculous things if used correctly. Now, to actually get the Rupture from this E.G.O, you do need to land heads, which can be a little annoying. Luckily, Sinclair should have about 30 SP coming in because of Lord Hongwu's passive, which helps a lot with consistency. Now, all you want to do is spam this E.G.O into as many skills as possible, preferably skills with a lot of unbreakable coins, and you'll see why. Sinclair should be gaining 10 sanity from winning a clash, so his chance to land heads will usually be around 85%, which makes it pretty reliable. Branch of Knowledge is the reason why we need to use Contemptal Ryoshu in the first turn, because Wrath in this team is basically non-existent, so the use in turn 1 was necessary. After using Branch for 2 to 3 turns, you should have near max or max Rupture potency, which means you basically win. If the battle is somehow still ongoing, you're going to roleplay as my dad and treat Sinclair like he never existed by using Lord Hongwu's power counter. By making sure Sinclair has the lowest HP percentage out of everyone on the field, you can retreat him and bring in a much better ID, which is why we wanted Sinclair to clash into high damaging unbreakable skills. After you get rid of Sinclair, the ID that's being brought in should be Gia Ishmael, and she will use her special skill when entering the fight. This shouldn't cause any issues if you saw a Spike Discharge on the enemy. Following all of that, you should have a high count, max potency Rupture stack in about 7 to 10 turns, which is pretty crazy. Sorry for that yap fest, but I felt like it was needed to show these two E.G.Os are both actually pretty good. I especially want to show that AEDD Gregor is not the potential man of E.G.Os like some people say he is. AEDD Gregor does not need a good Gregor ID to succeed, it needs a good Rupture team, and I hope what I said proved that. That about wraps up this Rupture-fueled section of the video, and now we're going to move on to a thankfully less complicated E.G.O. I think a prime example of an E.G.O getting relevance after an ID release is Capote Ishmael, which released all the way back in Season 2's Battle Pass. Capote Ishmael was fine when it first came out, and it got an ID that synergized with it shortly after its release with Lear Ishmael, but not to the level that Ardor Blossom started with Lear Ishmael, and that's primarily down to the fact that it's basically a straight downgrade from two other E.G.Os in terms of its effect. And those E.G.Os were Rhyme Shake and Fluids Like Dawn, which both shared the gimmick of doing a lot of SP damage. Capote Ishmael did do a little more than just SP damage with it spending wrath damage up and inflicting some burn, but nothing to write home about. But all that changed more than 2 years later with the release of Jeong Office Fixer Ishmael, aka Hannafrida Ishmael. Hannafrida Ishmael has one of the most interesting kits in the entire game. Her core gimmick revolves trying to use skills of a certain set affinity and discarding all the skills that don't match. One of Hannafrida Ishmael's main affinity she will want to use is Wrath, and that's the affinity of her skill 1. Now you may ask how Capote Ishmael fits into all of this. Well, the answer lies within Hannafrida Ishmael's passive. When Hannafrida Ishmael is either using an E.G.O or her skill 3, she gains 1 additional bright potency, when she wants to try to get to 5 to unleash her big nuke skill. On top of that, if using a skill that was the same affinity of the skill last turn, she also gain additional benefits like more bright potency and a tremor burst. Even with her skill 1 being the most common skill of her kit, you have a reason to use an E.G.O like Capote because of these additional benefits. Now, one thing you might be asking is, why not just use Ardor Blossom Star? Isn't an E.G.O also Wrath and cheap to use? That is true, but there's a reason why you don't want to use that E.G.O. Ardor Blossom Star takes up the He slot for Ishmael, which means you lose on another important E.G.O for Hannafrida Ishmael, Christmas Nightmare. Christmas Nightmare is great on Hannafrida Ishmael not just because it's a sloth E.G.O so it can be used in combination with her skill 2, but also because its passive and effects synergize really well with Hannafrida Ishmael as they're both Sinking and Tremor. The passive especially is important if you're using Hannafrida Ishmael on a Tremor team because it allows your team to ramp up quicker, so you don't want to lose out on it. One great thing about Capote is in Tremor can really ruin the enemy's SP, allowing for an already well-clashing team to clash higher, and negating the use for things like Tremor Chain. And if Ishmael is against a lot more SP from her passive, and she also deals more damage towards units that are in panic or low morale, which allows Capote to basically just act as an improved skill 1 for her. All things considered, Capote Ishmael is an underdog story at its finest, with it first being outshone by Utter Blossom Star, only to later find a niche in Tremor teams that allows me more effective when used correctly. It's quite interesting how the mediocre Burn Ego from Season 2 ends up being an important Tremor Ego in Season 6. Funny how that works out. The final Ego I want to talk about is another Battle Pass Ego. Yep, that's right, 4 Battle Pass Egos on this list. This time, the Ego I want to talk about is Hex Nail Sinclair, released in Season 5. Hex Nail Sinclair is pretty widely reviewed as just okay, and it doesn't really do all too much, but in my opinion it's actually a really good all-around Ego, and let me explain. Hex Nail Sinclair has a lot of effects, so I'll go through them one by one. First, it gains attack rate for every 3 envy resin, which allows its already good effects to spread to more enemies. Next, it reduces the enemy's curse if it has any after the attack is finished by 2. In case you don't know, curse is a debuff that's split into 4 random debuffs, those being attack power down, defense power down, offense all down, and defense all down. Every time curse gets reduced, you randomly select one of these effects and apply it to the enemy next turn. This Ego also inflicts curse, so you can basically view this effect as inflicting one of these debuffs at random 2 times next turn. After that is some bleak, which is fine. But next is the centerpiece of this Ego, which is it inflicting 2 curse, which can increase for every 2 debuffs on the enemy up to 4 curse total. You won't really need 3 debuffs on the enemy before this because this Ego also inflicts bleed, which makes this conditional super easy to fulfill. Because the Ego inflicted 4 curse total, you're very likely to get all of the curse effects. If you're especially lucky, you might get the attack power down to offense all down multiple times, which is really good. After that, it inflicts something else, and we have 4 curse on the enemies and inflicts some same turn clash power down. And to top it all off is some bind, which means this Ego can inflict a total of 9 different status ailments, which is crazy. And that's not even the best part of this Ego in my opinion. What I would consider to be the best part about this Ego is its passive, which is at combat start. If Sinclair has a negative effect, he gains 1 clash power up and 1 defense power up. You also gain some protection if you have a lot of debuffs, but that's not important. This passive synergizes with basically every Sinclair ID, especially in battles with unbreakable coins. But one ID in particular I want to highlight is Whiteless Sinclair because he's a self-Tremor ID. And since Tremor is a debuff, considering he's a 2-star tank ID. There's one more thing I want to mention about this Ego, and it's that, at least in my opinion, it has one of the very few corrosions in the game that's actually worth using. First, it gets 25 base power without losing any of its coins. Assuming that the targets are neutral to both Envy and Pierce, that means this Ego is already doing at least 150 damage. If the enemies are weak or fatal to Pierce or Envy, this Ego can genuinely put out a respectable amount of damage for a Teth Ego. Also, this Ego just gets rid of the attack rate conditional and the curse conditional, which means it can be used in any team and not just Envy teams. Its other conditionals change the tail sit and the clash power down conditionals now in Envy res conditional, which is arguably worse but still quite easy. I have no idea why this corrosion is actually quite solid considering most other corrosions usually are never worth using, just for flavor, but it makes this Ego unique and I really like Sinclair's corrosion voice line and animation, so that's a huge plus. In conclusion, Hex Nail Sinclair is a pretty glossed over Ego, mainly because Hex Nail Rodian outshone him by being better and having cooler animations, but still quite solid and really deserves to see more use instead of just being known as the only Sinclair set that doesn't suck. And that about wraps up all the Egos I wanted to talk about today. Though this video barely scratches the surface of how many Egos in this game really deserve more attention. I didn't realize how many of them gotten indirectly stronger over time thanks to new IDs and gameplay changes until making this video, and I really hope Projectmoon continues that trend with Deadsman 5 whenever that ends up happening. As of writing this, there are only 4 Egos that I would consider genuinely irredeemable, and if Projectmoon ever changes that, I would be more than happy about it. If you'd like to see a part 2 where I highlight even more overlooked Egos, let me know in the comments, and while you're here, consider subscribing. It really helps with feedback and lets me know you want more content like this. Anyways, thanks for watching.